What happens when a man who has built his entire life on rigid principles meets a woman who challenges everything he believes about justice, law, and love? Tell us in the comments what country you're watching from. My name is Thaddeus McKendrick, and for 12 years I've been the sheriff of Redemption Falls, Arizona. In all that time, I've never met a case I couldn't solve or a law I wouldn't enforce. The badge on my chest isn't just metal, it's a sacred trust that order will prevail over chaos. That's why, on this scorching September morning in 1876, I had no hesitation pursuing the band of gypsies terrorizing local merchants. Reports flooded in for weeks: stolen goods, missing livestock, and yesterday Mrs. Henderson's prized silver tea set vanished from her parlor during church services. "Sheriff McKendrick," Deputy Sam Collins called as I saddled my horse. "Mayor wants to see you before you ride out." I walked to Mayor Ashford's office, spurs clicking against wooden boards. The morning sun promised another day of desert heat that would test both man and beast. "Thad," Mayor Ashford said, looking up from complaint-laden papers, "I want those gypsies gone. Merchants threaten to take business elsewhere if we can't guarantee safety." "I understand, Ben. Got a lead on their camp, 5 miles south, near Devil's Canyon." "Good. Make sure they understand they're never welcome back." I collected Sam, and we rode hard through desert, following tracks through rocky terrain. The gypsy camp was colorful wagons arranged in a circle, with horses grazing nearby and clothes hanging from makeshift lines. "Looks quiet," Sam observed, checking his rifle. "Too quiet. Stay alert." We approached cautiously, but the camp seemed nearly deserted. Only elderly women and small children remained, younger adults nowhere visible. I was about to question the eldest woman when I heard commotion from behind a wagon. "Let me go. I've done nothing wrong." The voice was distinctly female, speaking English with a slight accent that gave words musical quality. Sam and I exchanged glances and moved toward the sound. What we found made my blood run cold. 2 of the town's less reputable citizens, Jake Morrison and his brother Pete, had cornered a young gypsy woman against a wagon wheel. Her dark hair was disheveled, colorful skirts torn, but her eyes blazed with defiance. "Well, well," Jake was saying, voice slurred despite the early hour. "Caught ourselves a little thief." "I am no thief," the woman spat, struggling against Pete's grip. "Jake Morrison," I called out, voice carrying 12 years of authority. "Step away from her, now." Both brothers turned, fear replacing predatory gleam in their eyes. They knew better than to cross me, especially when I used my official tone. "Sheriff McKendrick," Jake stammered. "We found her with stolen goods." What stolen goods?" Pete held up a silver teacup, surface gleaming in sunlight. "This here's from Mrs. Henderson's set, caught her red-handed." I looked at the young woman, taking in her appearance for the first time. Perhaps 22 years old, with olive skin and the most striking green eyes I'd ever seen. Her clothing was worn but clean, and despite circumstances, she held herself with dignity that commanded respect. "Is this true?" I asked her directly. "I have never seen this cup before in my life," she replied, chin raised defiantly. "These men placed it in my wagon themselves." "She's lying," Jake insisted. "We all know these gypsies are thieves." "What's your name?" I asked the woman, ignoring Jake's interruption. "Esmeralda Vadoma, and I am not a thief." "Miss Vadoma, you're under arrest for theft of Mrs. Henderson's silver. You have the right to remain silent, but anything you say can be used against you in court." For a moment, her composure cracked, and I saw fear flash across her features. But she quickly recovered, straightening her shoulders and meeting my gaze directly. "I understand," she said quietly. As I placed iron shackles around her wrists, I noticed her hands were soft, despite the rough life she must have lived. There was something about her, intelligence in her eyes, refinement in her manner, that didn't match common perceptions of gypsy thieves. "Sam," I said, "escort Miss Vadoma to the jail. I want to search the rest of the camp." The search yielded nothing else significant. The few remaining gypsies claimed ignorance of any theft, and I found no other stolen goods. Still, evidence against Esmeralda seemed clear. The cup had been found in her possession, sufficient for arrest. The ride back to town was conducted in silence. Esmeralda sat sideways on Sam's horse, hands bound, face turned away from us. But I found myself stealing glances at her profile, puzzled by contradictions I observed. Redemption Falls was a typical frontier town, with Main Street lined by general store, saloon, hotel, and church. The jail was small but sturdy, made of adobe and stone, with 2 cells in back and my office in front. It had been my second home for more than a decade. "Put her in the first cell," I instructed Sam. "Make sure she has water and food." "You're being surprisingly considerate," Sam observed. "Every prisoner deserves basic decency, regardless of their crimes." As Sam led Esmeralda into the cell, she turned back to look at me one last time. There was something in her expression, not quite gratitude, but perhaps recognition, that I was treating her more fairly than expected. "Sheriff McKendrick," she said softly, "may I ask something?" "What is it?" "Will you at least listen to my side of the story? Not now, but when you have time." I studied her face, looking for signs of deception. Instead, I saw something I didn't expect: hope. "We'll talk tomorrow," I said, "after you've had time to think about your situation." That evening, I sat in my office, reviewing case files, trying to understand why this particular arrest bothered me. I had arrested hundreds of criminals over the years, from cattle rustlers to cold-blooded killers. Why should one gypsy woman, clearly guilty of theft, cause me to question my methods? The answer came as I walked past her cell, checking locks for the night. She was sitting on the narrow cot, back straight, hands folded in her lap. She wasn't crying or pleading or raging against circumstances. She was simply waiting. "Miss Vadoma," I said quietly, "are you comfortable? Do you need anything?" She looked up at me, and I was struck again by intelligence in her green eyes. "I am well enough, Sheriff. Thank you for asking. The trial will be tomorrow afternoon. Judge Hartwell is fair, but strict about the law." "I understand." "Miss Vadoma, Esmeralda, why don't you tell me your side now? Maybe there's something I'm missing." She stood and walked to the bars, movements graceful despite circumstances. "May I ask you something first?" "I suppose." "Why did you become a sheriff?" The question caught me off guard. "To serve justice, to protect good people from bad ones. And how do you decide who is good and who is bad?" "The law decides that. Crime is crime, no matter who commits it." "But what if someone is accused of a crime they didn't commit? What if the law itself is wrong?" "The law isn't wrong. It's the foundation of civilization," she smiled sadly. "You have great faith in your law, Sheriff McKendrick. I hope it serves you well." "What does that mean?" "It means tomorrow you will send an innocent woman to prison because you believe more in rules than in truth. If you're innocent, prove it. How can I prove I didn't steal something? How can I prove those men didn't plant that cup? How can I prove anything to people who've already decided I'm guilty because of what I am?" Her words hit harder than expected. In 12 years of law enforcement, I had always believed evidence was evidence, guilt was guilt. But looking at this woman, hearing pain in her voice, I began to wonder if perhaps the world was more complicated than I had allowed myself to believe. "Tell me what happened," I said, pulling up a chair closer to the cell. "Start from the beginning." "My people came to this area 3 weeks ago," she began, voice soft but clear. "We are not thieves, Sheriff. We are traders, craftspeople, entertainers. We make our living honestly, moving from town to town, selling our goods and services. But you have a reputation. We have a reputation, because people fear what they don't understand. Yes, there are bad people among gypsies, just as there are bad people among your townspeople, but we are not all criminals." "Continue." 3 days ago, I went to town to sell jewelry, pieces I had made myself. I sold several items to different people, including a silver bracelet to Mrs. Henderson. You met Mrs. Henderson? Yes. She was very kind. She invited me into her home for tea, and we talked about my travels, about places I had seen. She was lonely, I think, and hungry for stories of the outside world. What happened then? Nothing. I left, thanked her for hospitality, and returned to our camp. I never saw her again, and I certainly never stole anything. But the cup, I have never seen that cup before today. Those men, the Morrison brothers, came to our camp early this morning demanding to search our wagons. They claimed someone had reported seeing stolen goods. I refused to let them search without proper authority, and they became angry. And they left, but returned about an hour later with that cup. They claimed they had found it in my wagon, but I know they placed it there themselves. I leaned back in my chair, considering her story. It was plausible, but also exactly what I would expect a guilty person to say. Miss Vadoma, do you have any proof of this? Any witnesses? The other women in camp saw the Morrison brothers return with the cup, but would you believe the testimony of gypsies against the word of your own townspeople? She had a point. In the eyes of most people in Redemption Falls, the word of a gypsy would carry little weight against that of established citizens, regardless of the citizen's character. I need to think about this, I said, standing up. Sheriff McKendrick, she called as I turned to leave. Thank you for listening. Most people wouldn't have bothered. That night, I lay awake in my small apartment above the jail, staring at the ceiling and replaying our conversation. For the first time in my career, I found myself questioning not just the facts of a case, but the entire system I had sworn to uphold. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Dr. Webb arrived at the jail just as I was having morning coffee, his face grave with concern. "Thad," he said, removing his hat, "I need to speak with you about Mrs. Henderson." "What about her?" "She's dead. Died in her sleep last night. But before she passed, she asked me to give you this." He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in shaky handwriting. Inside was a letter that made my blood run cold. "Dear Sheriff McKendrick, if you are reading this, then I have passed on, and I can finally tell the truth about what happened to my silver tea set. I was not robbed by that poor gypsy girl. I gave her several pieces of my silver as payment for a beautiful bracelet she made. She was so kind to me, so full of life and stories. I was ashamed to admit publicly that I had traded with a gypsy, so when people asked about my missing silver, I let them believe it was stolen. I never meant for anyone to be arrested. Please, if there is any way to make this right, do so. The girl is innocent. Margaret Henderson." The letter fell from my trembling hands as the full impact of what I had done crashed over me. I had arrested an innocent woman, destroyed her reputation, and nearly sent her to prison based on a lie born of social prejudice and fear. "Doc," I said, my voice hoarse, "what time did Mrs. Henderson die?" "Around midnight." "Why?" "Because I may have just made the biggest mistake of my life." Chapter 2. I raced to the jail cells, my heart pounding with a mixture of shame and urgency. Mrs. Henderson's confession letter crumpled in my sweating palm felt like evidence of my own moral failure. When I reached Esmeralda's cell, she was sitting on her cot, apparently resigned to her fate. When she saw me, she stood slowly, her expression wary. "Miss Vadoma," I said, my voice breaking slightly, "I owe you an apology. A profound, heartfelt apology." "What do you mean?" "You're innocent. Mrs. Henderson left a letter confessing the truth. She traded her silver to you willingly, but was too ashamed to admit it publicly. The Morrison brothers must have found out and saw an opportunity to cause trouble." For a moment she stood frozen, as if unable to process what I had said. Then, slowly, tears began to fill her beautiful green eyes. You believe me?" "I believe you, and I'm sorrier than words can express. I've wronged you terribly." As I unlocked her cell door, I realized that something fundamental had shifted inside me. The rigid certainty that had guided my life for 12 years was crumbling, replaced by something more complex and ultimately more human. "You're free to go," I said, stepping aside to let her pass. "And I want you to know that I will personally ensure the Morrison brothers face justice for what they did." She walked past me slowly, as if afraid that sudden movement might make this moment disappear. In the harsh morning light streaming through the jail windows, I could see the exhaustion in her face, the way the ordeal had taken its toll on her spirit. "Miss Vadoma," I said, following her into the main office, "I know my apology means little after what you've endured, but I want you to know that this mistake will haunt me for the rest of my life." She turned to face me, and I was surprised to see not hatred in her eyes, but something closer to understanding. "Sheriff McKendrick, may I ask you something?" "Of course." "What will you do now?" "About your townspeople who wanted to see me hanged, about the system that nearly sent an innocent woman to prison." Her question cut to the heart of everything I was struggling with. I don't know. I've spent 12 years believing that the law was absolute, that justice was simple, but you've shown me that the world is more complicated than I thought. "The world has always been complicated," she said gently. "You've just been fortunate enough to live in a position where you could ignore that complexity." "What do you mean?" "I mean that when you're a sheriff, a respected white man in a position of authority, the law works for you. But when you're a gypsy woman, an outsider, the law becomes a weapon used against you." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. I never intended." "I know you didn't intend it," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But intention and impact are different things. You may have acted with good intentions, but the impact was that you nearly destroyed my life based on prejudice and assumptions." Before I could respond, Deputy Sam burst through the door, his face flushed with excitement. "Sheriff!" he exclaimed, then stopped short when he saw Esmeralda standing free in the office. "What's going on? Why isn't she in her cell?" "She's been cleared of all charges," I said, standing up. "Mrs. Henderson confessed before she died that she traded her silver willingly." Sam's face cycled through confusion, embarrassment, and finally anger. "So the Morrison brothers set her up?" "Yes. I want them brought in for questioning immediately." "Yes, sir." He paused at the door. "Sheriff, the whole town is talking about this case. They're expecting a trial, expecting justice." "They'll get justice," I said firmly, "just not the kind they were expecting." After Sam left, I found myself alone with Esmeralda again. She was studying me with those penetrating green eyes, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see straight through to my soul. "You're troubled," she observed. "Wouldn't you be? I've spent my entire adult life believing I was serving justice, only to discover that I was serving prejudice." "Not prejudice," she said, surprising me. "Fear. Fear. People fear what they don't understand. Your townspeople fear gypsies because we're different, because we don't fit into their understanding of how the world should work. And you, Sheriff McKendrick, you fear a world where the law isn't absolute, where right and wrong aren't always clear." Our conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the window, I could see a crowd gathering in the street. Mayor Ashford was addressing them, his voice carrying clearly through the morning air. "Citizens of Redemption Falls," he was saying, "I understand there has been some confusion about the gypsy woman's case, but I want to assure you that our sheriff will not be swayed by any tricks or manipulations. Justice will be served." My blood ran cold. He was speaking as if the trial was still proceeding, as if Esmeralda was still guilty. He either didn't know about Mrs. Henderson's confession, or he was choosing to ignore it. "I have to go out there," I said, reaching for my hat. "Wait," Esmeralda said, catching my arm. "Before you do, you need to understand something. When you walk out that door and tell those people I'm innocent, you're not just changing my fate. You're challenging everything they believe about order, about hierarchy, about who deserves justice and who doesn't. Are you trying to talk me out of it? No. I'm trying to prepare you for what comes next. Because once you speak the truth, there's no going back. You'll be a different man, and this town will see you differently. The crowd outside had grown to nearly 50 people by the time I stepped onto the wooden porch of the jail. Mayor Ashford was still speaking, but his words died in his throat when he saw me. "Sheriff McKendrick," he said, his voice carrying false joviality. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing the trial arrangements." "There won't be a trial," I said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Miss Vadoma is innocent." The crowd erupted in angry murmurs. I saw Jake Morrison near the back, his face twisted with rage. Next to him stood Judge Hartwell, his expression thunderous. "What do you mean, innocent?" demanded the judge. "We have evidence, witnesses." "We have false evidence and lying witnesses," I replied, pulling Mrs. Henderson's letter from my jacket. "Mrs. Henderson confessed before she died that she traded her silver willingly to Miss Vadoma. She was too ashamed to admit it publicly, so when people asked about her missing silver, she let them believe it was stolen." "That's impossible!" Jake Morrison shouted. "I found that cup myself." "You planted that cup yourself," I replied, my voice carrying the authority of 12 years wearing the badge. "And you're under arrest for false evidence and conspiracy." The crowd began to shift uncomfortably. I could see doubt creeping into their faces as they processed what I was saying. "Furthermore," I continued, "I've sent Deputy Collins to search your property. If I'm right, we'll find the rest of Mrs. Henderson's silver hidden there, ready to be discovered to further implicate Miss Vadoma." Jake's face went pale, and I knew I had guessed correctly. He had been planning to plant more evidence to ensure Esmeralda's conviction. "This is outrageous," Mayor Ashford spluttered. "Sheriff McKendrick, you're letting yourself be manipulated by a gypsy witch." "I'm letting myself be guided by the truth," I replied. "Something I should have done from the beginning." It was then that Esmeralda stepped out of the jail behind me. The crowd fell silent, staring at her with a mixture of curiosity and hostility. She moved with dignity and grace, her head held high despite the circumstances. "Sheriff McKendrick," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd, "I thank you for your integrity, but I don't want to be the cause of your downfall." "You're not the cause of anything," I replied. "You're the victim of a system that values prejudice over justice." Before anyone could respond, Deputy Sam came running up the street, his face flushed with excitement. "Sheriff," he called out, "you were right. We found the rest of Mrs. Henderson's silver hidden in Jake Morrison's barn, along with other stolen goods from 3 different towns." The silence that followed was deafening. I saw Jake Morrison trying to slip away through the crowd, but Sam had already spotted him. "Jake Morrison," I called out, "you're under arrest for theft, conspiracy, and filing false reports." As Sam led Jake away in handcuffs, I turned back to the crowd. Many of them looked ashamed, realizing how close they had come to perpetrating a terrible injustice. "People of Redemption Falls," I said, "today we've learned an important lesson. We've learned that justice isn't about confirming our prejudices, it's about seeking truth, even when that truth challenges our comfortable assumptions." Several people in the crowd apologized to Esmeralda, but I could see that not everyone was convinced. Some still glared at her with suspicion and hostility. "Miss Vadoma," I said, turning to her, "you're free to go, and you have my word that you and your people will be treated fairly in this town." She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Thank you, Sheriff, but I think it would be best if we moved on. Sometimes the right thing to do is to leave a place where you're not truly welcome." The crowd was beginning to disperse, but I noticed that Judge Hartwell and Mayor Ashford remained, their faces dark with disapproval. "Sheriff," Mayor Ashford said, approaching me as the crowd thinned, "we need to talk. Privately. Whatever you have to say, you can say it here." "Very well. As of this moment, you are suspended from duty, pending a full investigation of your conduct in this case." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that you have compromised the integrity of your office by allowing personal feelings to override professional judgment." I felt Esmeralda stiffen beside me. "Personal feelings? It's obvious to everyone," Judge Hartwell said, his voice dripping with disdain, "that you've developed inappropriate feelings for this woman. Your judgment has been compromised." "My judgment has never been clearer," I replied. "But you're right about one thing. I have developed feelings for Miss Vadoma. I've developed respect for her dignity, admiration for her strength, and yes, affection for her character." "Sheriff," Esmeralda whispered, but I continued. "And if that disqualifies me from serving as sheriff, then perhaps this town needs a different kind of sheriff, one who values justice over prejudice, truth over comfortable lies." "Then you're fired," Mayor Ashford said coldly. "Effective immediately." As he reached for the badge on my chest, I caught his wrist. "I'll remove it myself," I said, unpinning the star that had defined my identity for 12 years. But as I held that badge in my hands, I realized that for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was without it. Chapter 3. The weight of the sheriff's badge in my palm felt strange, not heavy, as it had for 12 years, but somehow lighter, as if removing it had freed me from a burden I hadn't realized I was carrying. I looked at the piece of metal that had defined my entire adult life, then at Esmeralda, whose green eyes watched me with concern and something deeper. "Sheriff McKendrick," she said softly, "I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted you to lose everything because of me." "I haven't lost everything," I replied, placing the badge on the wooden railing of the jail porch. "I've lost a job, but I found something much more valuable." "What's that?" "I found out who I really am when I'm not hiding behind a badge." Mayor Ashford and Judge Hartwell were still standing nearby, their faces grim with disapproval. The remaining townspeople watched our exchange with curiosity and discomfort. "You're making a terrible mistake," Mayor Ashford said. "This woman will be gone tomorrow, and you'll be left with nothing." "Will you?" I asked, turning to Esmeralda. "Be gone tomorrow?" She studied my face for a long moment before answering. "My people are preparing to leave, yes. We've learned that it's best not to stay long in places where we're not wanted." "What if I told you that you are wanted, at least by one person in this town?" "I would say that one person cannot change the hearts of many." But one person can change their own heart," I said, stepping closer to her, "and sometimes that's enough to start something larger." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you'll have me, I'd like to travel with you, to learn about your world, your people, your way of life." The words hung in the air between us, and I watched her face carefully for any sign of her reaction. Around us, the remaining townspeople murmured in shock and disapproval. "You would leave everything you've known?" she asked. "Your home, your friends, your entire life." "What friends? What life? I've spent 12 years enforcing other people's prejudices and calling it justice. Maybe it's time I learned what justice really means." "You don't understand what you're asking," she said, but I could hear hope creeping into her voice. "Life with the Gypsies isn't easy. We face suspicion and hatred everywhere we go. We live day by day, never knowing what tomorrow will bring." "It sounds like freedom. It sounds like you're romanticizing a life you know nothing about." "Then teach me," I said, taking her hands in mine. "Show me what it means to live without the constraints of other people's expectations." She looked down at our joined hands, and I saw tears forming in her eyes. "Thaddeus, I've never met anyone like you." "Is that good or bad?" "It's terrifying and wonderful at the same time." Judge Hartwell cleared his throat loudly. "This is absolutely disgraceful. A former sheriff running off with a band of gypsies, like some lovesick schoolboy." "Judge," I said, not taking my eyes off Esmeralda, "with all due respect, I don't care what you think. You'll care when you're starving on the trail, when you realize what you've thrown away for a moment of infatuation." "This isn't infatuation," I said, finally turning to face him. "This is the first time in my life I felt truly alive." Esmeralda squeezed my hands, and when I looked back at her, I saw that she had made her decision. "My people are camped 5 miles south of town," she said. "If you're serious about this, if you truly want to learn our ways, then come to us at sunset, but understand, once you make this choice, there's no going back. You'll be as much an outsider as we are." I'm already an outsider, I said, looking around at the unfriendly faces of the people I had served faithfully for 12 years. I just didn't realize it until now. She smiled then, the first genuine smile I had seen from her, and it transformed her entire face. Then I'll see you at sunset, Thaddeus McKendrick. I spent the rest of the day gathering my few personal possessions and saying goodbye to the life I had known. It was remarkable how little I actually owned that mattered to me. Some clothes, a few books, my father's pocket watch, and a small amount of money I had saved over the years. As the sun began to set, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and red, I saddled my horse and rode south toward the Gypsy camp. My heart was pounding with excitement and terror, but underneath it all was a sense of rightness, of finally moving in the direction I was meant to go. The camp was even more beautiful in the evening light than it had been in the harsh glare of morning. The colorful wagons formed a perfect circle around a central fire, and the sound of music and laughter drifted across the desert air. Children ran between the wagons playing games I didn't recognize, while women prepared food and men tended to the horses. Esmeralda was waiting for me at the edge of the camp, dressed in a flowing red dress that seemed to capture the colors of the sunset. She looked like something from a dream, something too beautiful and wild to be real. "You came," she said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. "Did you think I wouldn't? I hoped you would, but I also know how difficult it is to leave everything you've known." "I'm not leaving everything," I said, dismounting and walking toward her. "I'm leaving the parts of my life that were built on lies and prejudice. I'm keeping the parts that are real." "And what parts are those?" "The part that values truth over comfort. The part that chooses justice over law. The part that's falling in love with you." She stepped closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "Thaddeus, I need you to understand something. I'm not some exotic prize to be won. I'm not a symbol of your rebellion against your old life. I'm a real woman with real flaws and real needs. I know that. Do you? Because I've seen men become fascinated with the idea of gypsy women, with the romance and mystery they imagine we represent. But when they discover we're just human beings, they lose interest. I'm not those men. Prove it." Before I could ask what she meant, she led me into the camp. The other gypsies looked up as we approached, their faces showing various degrees of curiosity and suspicion. An elderly woman stepped forward, her dark eyes studying me intently. I recognized her as one of the women who had been in the camp when I arrested Esmeralda. "This is Madame Rowena," Esmeralda said. "She is our leader, our wise woman." "Why should we trust him?" Madame Rowena asked, her voice carrying the weight of years of experience. "He arrested our Esmeralda based on lies and prejudice." "Because," Esmeralda said, "he also freed me when he learned the truth, and he sacrificed his career to defend me against his own people." "Pretty gestures," Madame Rowena said dismissively. "But can he live our life? Can he face the hatred and suspicion that follows us everywhere? Can he sleep on the ground and eat simple food and never know where his next meal will come from?" "I can try," I said, stepping forward, "and I can learn." "Learning is not enough," she said. "You must prove that you belong here, that you're not just a tourist seeking adventure." "How do I do that?" "By surviving your first month with us. By showing that you can contribute to our community, not just burden it. By proving that your commitment to Esmeralda is real, not just an infatuation." "I accept your challenge." That night, I slept on the ground beside the fire, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of wood smoke and desert sage. It was the most uncomfortable night of my life, but also somehow the most peaceful. For the first time in years, I wasn't worried about tomorrow's responsibilities or yesterday's mistakes. Esmeralda lay nearby, and in the dying light of the fire, I could see her profile against the star-filled sky. "Thaddeus," she whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear her. "Yes? Are you afraid?" "Terrified," I admitted, "but also more alive than I've ever been." "Good. Fear keeps us honest." "Esmeralda." "Yes?" "I love you." The words hung in the air between us, and for a moment I thought I had made a terrible mistake, but then she turned toward me, and I could see tears glistening in her eyes. "I love you too," she whispered, "and that terrifies me more than anything." "Why?" "Because I've never trusted anyone enough to love them before, but you risked everything for me. You chose me over your entire life. How can I not love a man who would do that? I didn't choose you over my life. I chose you as my life, and I choose you as mine." When we kissed, it was like coming home to a place I had never been, but had always been searching for. Her lips were soft and warm, and she tasted like freedom and possibility and all the adventures we would share together. Over the following weeks, I learned to live as a gypsy. I learned to find water in the desert, to read the mood of a town before entering it, to tell fortunes for curious townspeople, and to craft jewelry from silver and turquoise. I learned to sing the haunting songs that told the stories of Esmeralda's people, and to dance around the fire under the endless western sky. But more than that, I learned to live without the rigid structure that had defined my entire adult life. I learned to embrace uncertainty, to find joy in the simple act of being alive, to value people over possessions and experiences over security. 3 months after leaving Redemption Falls, Esmeralda and I were married in a traditional gypsy ceremony, surrounded by the people who had become my new family. We exchanged vows under the stars, promising to love each other through all the hardships and joys that lay ahead. "Do you ever regret it? Do you ever?" she asked me on our wedding night as we lay together in our wagon, listening to the sounds of celebration continuing around the campfire. "Regret what?" "Giving up your old life, your security, your reputation, your place in the world." "I didn't give up my place in the world," I said, pulling her closer. "I found it." 6 months later, we received word that Deputy Sam had been elected Sheriff of Redemption Falls and was working to reform the justice system, ensuring that prejudice would never again masquerade as law. The Morrison brothers had been sentenced to prison, and the town was slowly learning to judge people by their actions rather than their appearance. As we continued our journey across the American West, I realized that my story of redemption was not about a sheriff who fell in love with a gypsy thief. It was about a man who discovered that true justice comes not from enforcing the law, but from following the heart. I had learned that love is stronger than prejudice, that understanding is more powerful than fear, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply choosing to see the humanity in someone others have deemed unworthy. The rigid sheriff who had arrested an innocent woman based on prejudice and assumption was gone forever. In his place was a man who had learned to live with uncertainty, to find strength in vulnerability, and to discover that the greatest adventures begin when we have the courage to leave our comfortable cages and embrace the wild, wonderful complexity of the world beyond. Thanks for following this incredible story of love conquering prejudice. What did you think of Sheriff McKendrick's transformation from rigid lawman to free-spirited traveler? Did you expect him to give up everything for love? Tell us in the comments what part of the story moved you most, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more epic Old West adventures.